My Grandfather, the Revolutionary, written and narrated by Ankita Som. My grandfather, Shukhendu, finds himself in Kolkata in the late 1920s. No one in the family was able to provide a proper date, so I'm being very vague here. When I asked his eldest son, my uncle, who I call Boro Jethu, which literally translates to the elder uncle, he told me that his first few years in Kolkata was a constant struggle to exist. Those are the exact words he used. He was a teenager, he had no connections, no skills, no prospects as such, and definitely had no money. And at this time, Kolkata particularly was going through a period in history where it was considered a center for revolutionary ideas. A lot of migrants were coming into the city. It was really becoming the Kolkata that we know now, vibrant and political revolutionary ideas at every street corner. And the Indian independence movement was particularly taking wind during these years. I'm not really sure how my grandfather contributed to the independence movement after he came to Kolkata. I think from the stories that my Boro Jethu and my other uncles and aunts have told me, including my father, it was rather him just having a very difficult life, him struggling day to day and figuring out ways to make money, ways to feed himself. To him, the freedom movement was perhaps a second thought. To him, to survive was the first struggle. I do know that after independence in 1947, he got married to my grandmother. And since then, he settled in a place in Kolkata called Birati, a particular suburb really close to the airport. But I think it's interesting that he lived in Birati, and then a lot of his younger brothers and sisters came to Birati to live with him. And while he lived here, he did all kinds of businesses because he was having children one after the other. My Boro Jethu was born, and then my other uncle, and then my aunt, really rather quickly. So he had to find a way to make money. My aunt told me, or in other words, my Pishi, which translates into my father's sister, or my aunt, she told me that he did all kinds of businesses, just gave a hand at everything, and he was really creative as to how he went with it. But it wasn't until years later that he was recognized for what he went through during the British Raj in India. My Boro Jethu tells a story of how he was reading the newspaper one day and saw in the newspaper that there was a scheme that the Indian government was taking out. It was to give martyrs, people who had died during the freedom movement or under the British Raj, or had suffered during the freedom movement under British rule in a prison or something. They would be offered a chance to get something called the Indian Oil Distributorship, which is really a business that the government would simply give you, and it was through the Indian Oil Corporation. It's basically distributing cooking gas to a community or a whole neighborhood. And this was a really lucrative business and still is, because the Indian government sort of has a monopoly on this. Also, you're already given a set list of customers, so it's not like you would have to really compete with anyone else or fight for customers because people needed cooking gas to cook. So my grandfather applied, and he did try and retry, because it apparently is very hard to get And the only reason he did got ultimately was because when he was 16 or 17, so many years ago, and spent a few nights in a British jail, that he was able to get this business. Which is so interesting to me because that is the business my father inherited from him. That is the business that paid my school fees, my brother's school fees, that paid all the luxuries I had in life, and still helps me out once in a while, even though I'm in Australia. And I wonder what he would have thought of that. That his little act when he was 15 or 16 then helped out his son, which is now helping out me, and will probably have an impact on my children too. So I find myself half an hour away from turning 22, being really grateful that he did what he did, and so grateful that he had such a hard life and was able to overcome it. And I, now being 2 generations away from him, reaping the benefits of his hard work. So here I am. At 22, I haven't spent a night in a British jail. I find myself in a first world country, getting a first-class education, recording a podcast about my grandfather because I can and I want to. And that, to me, I think is excellent progress. I like to think that I am a little bit like my grandfather. I too have journeyed a long way, living now in Wollongong, which is a small town, and that is, I think, a similar experience to what he had. Maybe perhaps the opposite. He moved from a village to a big city like Kolkata. But in general, for me, I think Wollongong is different, wildly different. And I find it really interesting that how, if you ask most Indians or Indian students, perhaps I shouldn't speak for everyone, but a few of my friends who are Indians, all need something to play in the background at night to fall asleep to. Wollongong is very quiet, almost too quiet. A lot of us, including myself, cannot go to sleep without having some kind of noise in the background. I suppose that's just what we're used to. We're used to some noise while we fall asleep to. It's almost comforting. And that alone speaks volumes how wildly different it is growing up in India, particularly in Kolkata. I once found myself in a class group where all of the other students were Australians. Some were from Wollongong, some weren't. And they were having a really robust discussion about what beaches were the best, comparing their own hometown beaches and so on. And I found myself listening to them as an audience, really unable to participate, because to me every single beach is absolutely beautiful. I've been very lucky because for work I get to travel a little bit, go for long drives around the country, and even not even the long drives to like Canberra or Sydney, even a short drive, like a 30-minute drive from Wollongong to Shell Harbour. I find that very, very beautiful. That is something you don't get to see in Kolkata. Surrounded by beautiful mountains and clear blue skies. It's every time I make that drive, it gives me goosebumps. I've been here for 2 years and I drive there almost every day, if not every other day. And to me, it still remains an extremely beautiful drive. But Kolkata, I suppose, has its charms. It is beautiful in its own way. We have our remnants of colonial history, and then we have modern Bengali culture finding a way to pave in. There's, of course, food, difference in water, and the stark difference in culture and lifestyle. But I also like to think of the similarities in Wollongong. People are hardworking, and people like to be generally happy. I think Australians and Indians have one thing in common, is that both of these cultures love to party. Perhaps not as much drinking on the Indian side, but definitely the urge to have a good time is there. Coming back to my grandfather, Shukhendu Som, I like to think that the family, still to this day, represents his values in a way. The value of hard work and love for one's community, and of course the value and love in one's family. He knew that it was his responsibility to make sure that his children never suffered like he did. And because of that thought, that thinking, that way of life, that keen realization of one's responsibility, even his grandchildren, 8 grandchildren, have never had to suffer like he did. And that, to me, is really interesting, and I'm very thankful that he did do that, that his hard work, in the end, paid off. And perhaps he wasn't that much of a revolutionary, very briefly, really. He was a businessman, he was a strict father, he was a community leader. But more than that, he was a good man. And that, who he was, Shukhendu Som, was a good man. Thank you.